So today we're going to look at kind of doing this disintegration type effect, particle swipe, particle reveal, whatever you really want to call it. It's not a true disintegration, which is why I'm not calling the tutorial that, but if you do want to see that, then let me know and I can maybe do a couple of things. But this tutorial is going to be a little bit back to front. You see my normal process, I take you through a very linear and segmented process where we do the render at the end. But I'm going to drop in this rock, we're going to set up the render, then we're going to do the particles, and then we're going to come back to the render at the end. So if you did lose your mega scans a year ago, they're back on Epic Games Launcher now. This works with Octane, it works with Redshift, and you can just export the mega scans straight into Cinema just like we used to be able to do. And the rock that I used in the render was this Nordic beach rock. Now I'm going to take two versions of this. I'm going to take the raw and I'm going to take the high. And I'll explain why in a little second. So I'm going to take the high and I'm going to take the raw. That one's going to take a couple seconds longer to come into the software. And you can see we've got a very, very, very high density mesh and a very low one. So we can call this rock and we can call this collide. Because what we're going to do is we're going to use this lower density mesh to collide off of. And this is really important in particles. Whether you're spawning them or you're growing vertex maps or you're colliding or you're using objects to kill particles. Particles tend not to like that very much when you're using a very high density mesh. So I would suggest with whatever you're using, whether it's a logo, a surface, whatever you're using to make this effect, make a low res version of your mesh. Because we're going to hide it, we're not going to render with it, but it's super important to have. And we're going to keep both these materials for now, and I'll explain why in a second as well. Now, as I'm sort of setting things up here, of course, I'm going to come to the size of a cube. I'm going to scale my rocks all the way up here. And I, of course, do want to mention that just like every other tutorial, the first 10 people that hit that link in the description will get my Patreon for free for a month. But if you missed that, don't worry, because there's 50% off for the whole of this month. Now, I'm going to angle this rock somewhere that looks okay. I'm kind of going to tilt it up because the way that I did this effect is I, kind of blew the particles off the bottom. But if we look at a couple of other references here using the exact same effect, there's the really, really cool animation that I did a couple months ago with David over at RenderFolk. Shout out David. That was a really, really cool render, and that is just with this same effect, but it's on a surface. But of course, today we're doing it with a rock. And like I said, we're going to get started on the render a little bit right now. So I'm going to drop in the Octane live viewer, and I am doing this in Octane, so I apologize if you were waiting for Redshift. I just love Octane too much. And you can see we've got this rock. Now we don't want to be looking at the collide rock. We want to look at our proper rock. I'm going to drop in a camera. We can set this to 200 millimeters on the focal length. We'll come into the camera, and I'm going to zero all this out, and we're going to get back on the Z-axis. And I think, honestly, the reason I'm kind of trying to do this a little bit different today is because this would be my general workflow, is I would set up the rock, I would make sure that the materials look good on it and all that sort of stuff before I start messing with particles. So I'm going to lock the live viewer, I'm going to set it to path tracing. Now, if you're typically a Redshift user and you're not used to a unbiased render engine, you can see with Octane that when I drop in a texture environment, this is our primary environment, we can only use one HDRI. We can use a primary environment and a visible environment. And this primary environment, the second I make it black, is going to determine our shadows. So in Octane, we have to set up our shadows before we do anything else, otherwise the render will look all grey and all nasty. And then if I drop in a area light, I right click it, animation tags, target. If you've seen my videos, you've seen this stuff a million times before. You know what we're doing. You middle mouse click, or you hit this up here, you get 4 different views, right? If I come to this second one here, which is also all of these views, F1, F2, F3, F4. If I press F2, I come to the top view. It really doesn't matter what one you do. And I do cameras, perspective. Now, of course, the Octane camera is on this angle, but I can see and move around the viewport at this angle. So it's really, really important for lighting because now I can push this light off to the side and kind of light the scene how I want without being restricted to that camera angle. So then I'm just going to duplicate that light. I'm going to push it to the back a little bit. I'm literally just going to do 2 lights. That's all I'm going to do. And I might come back to these. I might mess with them a little bit. But that's it. Let's call this environment shadow. And then I'm going to drop in a texture environment again. I'm going to turn it off in the viewport because I don't like when it makes everything white. But like I explained before, this time I'm going to make it a visible environment. And then if I come to this and I drop in a gradient, and I come into the gradient, and I do 2D V, so it's vertical, and then I just mess with these knots a little bit and create a little black to white gradient. And you can see that we're just seeing this light up here and we don't want to see that. So the way we get rid of that is we highlight these light tags. We go to visibility, we go to camera visibility, and we turn them straight off. Now what I want to do is mess with this material, and this is why I said keep both materials. We'll delete one in a second, but if we go to the Octane node editor and we open up this material, there's something about when we bring in the raw object, because it's such a high density mesh, it doesn't bring in the displacement map. But I actually still want a little bit that displacement. So if you come into this one, you can see we have a displacement map. So I'm going to take it, because I think it still makes things look quite good. So if I go to the transform and I pop this in the transform there, I come to the displacement, I put this in here, and I set this to 4K for now, and I set it to a displacement of 1. As you can see, it's going to add all these little bumps and stuff, but I don't really want much. And I think what I actually used on my original render was about 5. So if we do 0.5. Now what you have to be wary of when you're bringing in megascans, whether it's rocks, logs, whatever it is, you have to be very careful with the maps that come in. And this is another reason I wanted this to be at the beginning of the tutorial, because it's very important when you bring in, whether it's a megascan or a model, but more importantly with megascans, it's very important to mess with these materials a little bit and not leave them on default. So this bump is actually adding all these kind of nasty bumpy parts that doesn't look very realistic. So if I drop the power of that bump way down, and you can see if I turn it off, the rock gets significantly smoother. And if I turn it up, it's got all those little bumps on it. You might think that those bumps add realism, but they don't really. So we're going to get rid of those bumps. I'm going to come to the color correction, because another thing you may have noticed is I didn't actually use the colors that came with this. So what I'm getting at is it's very important when you bring in these mega scans to mess with the material a little bit. If you leave it default, it's not going to look as good as it can look. So I'm going to drop the saturation a little bit, and I'm maybe going to, you can see if I increase the gamma, we kind of get rid of some of those patches, but if we decrease it, it brings them up a little bit. I'm maybe just going to come up a slight bit. Now the roughness, I don't want that roughness map at all. And if you're newer to 3D, you might think, oh, it's a roughness map, I'm going to use it. But I kind of want to determine my own roughness. Now I don't want it this shiny, that doesn't look nice. I'm just going to crank the roughness relatively high, but I'm kind of going to get a little bit more shine off of it than what I would have got from that roughness map. And I can always drop the specular as well. So I could drop the specular a little bit, which is going to be the overall reflectivity of the object. If you take that to 0, the object will be diffuse, 0 reflection. But I can just kind of balance out these values, and I can get something that bounces off the light a little bit more without looking wet. If you want it to look wet, you can make it look wet, but I don't want it to look wet. So what we're going to do now, we've set up some lighting, we've set up our shadows, we've set up the material a little bit. We don't need that old rock anymore. We can rename this to rock. We can come up here and we can do 2560 by 1440. That will be 2K in resolution. So the image is nice and sharp in the viewport now. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the imager. I'm going to enable the camera imager. And this is another very important part of the render that's going to clear things up. If you neglect the camera, you're neglecting the render. This is such a big part of the render and making everything look good. I'm going to turn up this highlight compression. That's going to balance everything out. Now we could use ACES tone mapping, but I have lots that I love to use. Somebody called Kim Amland made them. I mention them in every video. I have links to them everywhere. Have a scramble about. You'll find them. I'm going to pop this LUT in the camera. So you can see what that LUT has done. Just bumped up the render. Bigger whites, darker blacks. That's all we need. We don't need to do anything crazier. So now I can just balance this out with the exposure and the gamma and find a place in the image that is balanced. Because you can see now if I crank off that LUT, look how flat everything looks. It didn't look that flat a second ago, but now your eyes have seen this. It looks a little bit flat. We can add a little bit of vignetting, just a little bit. And we're more using the vignetting to again dial in the highlights of the image rather than, and to kind of funnel the eye to the middle of the image rather than to actually add a vignette, if you know what I mean. The next thing I want to do is these shadows are pitch black. We don't want the shadows to be pitch black. Let's lighten them up a little bit. So if we come into the shadow and we just start to boost this up a little bit till there's some information in there, you're going to find that makes the render appear a little bit more realistic. Even more so with a rock like this, that's maybe we want it to look like it's being hit by daylight, is if you just put a little bit of blue in the shadow, you're going to get a very, very nice realistic feeling. Now coming back to the lights, relatively happy with them. I could maybe just budge them a bit, have them pin up the object a little bit more. maybe round the side a little bit more. And let's come back to these rocks. That one doesn't need a material. Let's put these in a group and call them rock. The reason I'm doing that is because I need these to be facing the same way at all times. So if I wanted to rotate this to find different compositions, it's very important, of course, that we're rotating both of the rocks. So you can see there's so many different angles that I could do. I'm just kind of tossing and turning until I find something I marginally like the look of. This angle's quite good. I think this is actually quite similar to the angle that I had on the original render, with something a little bit like this. Because then, if you are rotating the object, you might want to come back with the lights a little bit again, and you kind of want to do these things in tandem to one another until you get something that looks and feels very realistic and very, very nice. Maybe just straighten that up a little bit and pull back a little bit. And I can't actually decide whether I like it more at that angle or more pointing downwards like this, because I also like that. So let's just say I went with something like that for now, okay? I'm not going to spend ages rotating the rock till I love it for the video. But for your render, I definitely would do, because you want your render to look awesome, right? Let's go to the render settings. Max samples, 248. We don't really need any more samples like that. We don't really need any more samples than that. If you need more samples than that, I would say you've got issues with your lighting. Diffuse depth, I mean, we're not really going to use any glass, so we could do 8 on the diffuse and specular and all of that. GI clamp, we could do 100. Okay, so that's it for the render. We've set the render up. It looks good. You don't really need to do anything else. I would say this is enough, and this is fine. So we can tidy the scene before we do some particles now. So I'll drop in a null, and we come to the icon, just to be a little bit neat, you know. We call this lighting. We can duplicate this for later. Grab everything to do with the lighting, put it in there. Of course, we have a camera, so we can duplicate that, call it camera. And we can duplicate it again, call it geo. Put the rocks in there, duplicate it again, call it particles. We'll put our particles in there. So that's it, render set up. If you wanted to know how to make a rock look good, then there you go, you've learned that. But now we're, of course, we're going to do some particles. So what you kind of need to know about this effect is it's very, very simple, but it's one of those effects that just takes a little bit tweaking to get it right, a little bit back and forth. I'm going to take my materials off in the viewport, and I'm going to turn the lights off for now as well. This is going to be quite important, so I can kind of see the particles, see everything that's going on. So now if I pop out the camera, and I turn off the work plane in the filter, this is kind of a nice, I'll turn off the horizon as well. So it's kind of a nice zone for us to work on the particles. Now, let's go to simulate emitters, and let's grab a mesh emitter. That's going to drop in a particle group, so we're going to put that in the particle group, and we're going to put the particle group in our particles folder. And we can call this rock particles. Cool. So we come to the mesh emitter. We have this mesh emitter. I will make this a little bit bigger for you. Mesh emitter. Maybe not that big. Okay. Go to emission. We're just going to emit on the surface, and we're going to emit on the surface of our main geometry. Not the collide geometry, but the main geometry in the scene. We're going to set the amount of frames in the scene to 300. Now, right now, we're emitting on a constant. We don't really want to do that. We want to emit on a shot. And if right now I set this to 100,000 particles, so that's 1 extra 0, 2, 3 extra zeros, and we hit play, the particles are going to spawn in, and they're going to fly away from the rock in the direction of the normals of the rock surface. We don't want that. So we're going to go to properties, and we're going to go to the speed. We're going to put this to 0. Take off the speed entirely. You hit play now. The particles sit on the rock. Whether you're using a logo, whether you're using a surface, whatever you're using, of course, this is very important. So we've got 100,000 particles right now. We're going to need way more than that, but we'll come to that soon. And we're emitting on the rock. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to add a wind modifier. So we're going to simulate forces wind. And this is going to be quite important here. The wind by default is going to come in facing a random direction, right? So if I just tilt it up, you can see there. If I move it off to the side, it doesn't matter where the wind is in the scene, right? It just matters where it's rotated. So if I hit play now, all the particles are going to fly up. And they're not going to fly up very quickly. We can put this in the particle group as well, because it's on a strength of 5. So let's do 500. Something a little bit better than 5. You can see they're all just going to fly up to the left it is basically just like a normalized movement. There's no turbulence, there's nothing going on. Of course, there is turbulence here that we can enable by turning up the frequency and just the amount of turbulence, and that will give it some. But the wind turbulence, I'm actually not a very big fan of. You can bring down the scale, which helps a lot. And you can see now that that gives it more of a turbulent, but it just kind of stretches it out. And we'll come back to this because we will use it a little bit, but not much. So we can zero all that out. But right now, you need to understand what the wind's doing. It's just pushing the particles away. But we don't want it to move through the rock. We want it to be on the surface of the rock. So let's set that up. But of course, first of all, I'm going to save the scene. So as you can imagine, we're going to use this object. So we're going to go right-click, Simulation Tags, and we're going to go to Collider. But we need to go to Simulation Modifiers, and we need to add this Collider modifier. And if we put this in the particle group, and we hit play now, let's see what happens. Okay, right, the particles move around the rock. Now if we turn down the bounciness and turn up the friction a little bit, and I turn off the normal rock as well, what we need to have a look for here is that the particles are not going inside the rock. And if you have a look right now, they are. There's a couple ways around this. One of them is going to be, if we have a look at this Collide rock, what we want to do is just make it a tad smaller than the object they're spawning on. So we have a look now, you should see the effect gets a little bit better, but there's still potentially, there is still a couple of particles on the inside of the rock. The next way around this is in the Collide object, you can set a slight radius, 0.5, 0.2, a tiny, tiny little radius. That's also going to help. The next way around it is if you do Control D, you go to Simulation, Particles, is just adding another substep, which is more calculations per frame. It's going to slow the scene down, but it won't slow it down enough. That should be enough to make sure no particles go inside the rock at all. Next thing we're going to do, we're going to go to the particle group. We're going to draw these to their true scale. So we're actually not going to mess with the scale of the particles, but the default kind of viewing option of them is a little bit strange. So we're going to hit draw radius and we're going to pull this down to the lowest it can go. And now you can see that we can see the actual radius of the particles. But one thing that's very important when you're look deving particles in general, or making a particle simulation, art directing a particle simulation, is you don't really want them all to be one color. Whether you're going to use that color data or not, it's quite important that we see them in different colors. So if we go to the properties and we go to the color and we go to the noise and we come back to the beginning now, and I just hit play on one frame, you can see now it's spawned in with this noise on it. Now this noise is stuck to the particles, which is really cool because now as they fly away, the color stays on them. But coming back to this wind here, there's something we need to do with it to sell this effect. And as you can imagine, it's a linear field, or any kind of field. But with this linear field, is if we come and grab the wind, and we go to the coordinates of that wind, and we put it back and zero everything out. We come to the linear field, we zero everything out. I'm going to set this to -x. I'm going to take the wind and I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees. So the wind and the linear field are facing the same direction. Because now if we group these and we call it wind, and just again for scene tidiness, let's grab a, I don't know, just like the folder icon. That'll work. But the reason I'm doing this is because if we angle this at any kind of angle and we hit play, you can see now that the wind has been restricted. So the particles are all going to flutter away based on where that linear field has been. But that linear field is facing the wrong direction. I actually should have kept this on -x because we want it to peel back from the opposite side. So if I was to move this down here and then move it through, you can see it peels them off. You can rotate it. You can do anything. And they're completely conjoined with each other. So it doesn't matter which direction we're facing or what we're doing. They're facing the same direction. And I can make the particles do whatever I want. If I zero all these out, and we just do a slight angle for now, just like this, we're actually going to do something a little bit different in this video. I'm going to show you something a little bit more advanced. But if you are doing more of this wind swipe, like the examples I showed you at the beginning of the video, there's a couple of things we need to set up. And as you can imagine, that's turbulences. So we go to forces turbulence. We'll draw up in this turbulence. And let's do a very, very small scale, like 1. And we do the strength on like 15. But as you can imagine, that linear field needs to go in the turbulence too. So you can see wind gets affected, turbulence gets triggered. We can duplicate this. We can do a scale of 5, strength of 20, duplicate it again. This will be our bigger one, 25, strength of 20. You can see now you've got more of an effect. So if you come to the turbulences, we rename this small, medium, big. And we come to the wind itself, and now we give this a little bit of turbulence, and you bring the scale down to something like 100. So if you do 100, and you do the turbulence in 25, and we do the frequency in 50, all of these effects combined is going to give you more of the effect that we want. Or we can push this through and have it peel back. But you can see the turbulence, that's actually going a bit too crazy. We want that direction to be persistent. So that's the big turbulence that's doing that. If I hit play now, move through it, you still see it's a little bit crazy. So if I turn off all of them, what we really want is that peel over, the way it peels back over it. So if I enable the small one and the medium one could be a little bit too strong. And of course the turbulence in the wind as well is a big culprit. Let's get the big one back on as well. And cool, we have a pretty cool effect. I'm going to turn up the amount of particles now. So let's come to 500,000. 500,000 particles. Hit play, you can see the effect a little bit more. Now, of course, if this is the effect that you want, similar to some of the examples I showed you, then all you do is you animate this, just like that. Now, as you can imagine, in the example I showed you with the work that I did with David, I wasn't using a wind, I was using a field force with a spherical field. And I was growing that and pushing the particles out on the surface. Now, because I can't put this particular project file up on my Patreon, I'm instead going to put a project file with a scene setup similar to that. So if I show you a couple images of that render and a couple of viewport renders and a little screen recording of the viewport and that render, you will see the way that's kind of set up. And that's more for like a surface reveal or a wind swipe on the ground. Of course, you could do this on the ground as well, as I did do both versions of that as we kind of progressed through the project. But with this wind and what it's doing right now, I'm actually not going to use the linear field. We're going to do something a little bit different. Rather than animating this linear field up and moving it across all the particles, we're going to get these particles to drop down. So let's take off the linear field and make sure they're all gone at the turbulences, and then come back to the wind and let's just rotate it downwards. That wind is rotating downwards, the rocks fall. That wind is downwards, the particles just fall off the rock. Super cool. We need this to be progressive, similar to what we did with the linear field, but we don't want to do it with the linear field because there's a different way we can do this. So I'm going to take off the turbulences for a second. I'm going to take off the wind. We're going to enable the collide object. I'm going to turn off the wind in the viewport as well, just because you can see there. I'm going to right click on the collide, other tags, vertex map. I'm going to come back and enable my move tool because I don't want to use the brush that comes with it. We come to the vertex map, we enable fields. And if this freeze that comes in by default, if I change this to grow and then I add a spherical field in here and I just have this spherical field connect, turn off the particles, and I just have it connect with the bottom of the object, what you can see happens is this vertex map grows out. Now, if you don't know vertex maps at all, what you need to know about them is yellow means yes and red means no. So you can do this to trigger and generate effects based off of this. So if I had it at the top, what's going to happen? It animates down. If I had it at the bottom, what's going to happen? It animates up. So I'm going to zero this out. And it's came in at a funky rotation, and that's kind of to do with all these nulls up here and the rotations that they're holding. Now, just for scene neatness and kind of just being a pro, right? The rock and where it's rotated right now, we don't really want it to think that it's at the rotation that it's at. So if I enable this axis tool here, and then I come down to these coordinates here, and I zero these out, you can see that's reset the axis. So if I turn that off now, and I come to the rock and the collide, you can see that that rotation has moved down to those. So if I do the same thing on these objects, and I zero them out with the axis enabled, 0, 0, you can see the spherical field now knows its rotation. So without the axis enabled, I can zero that out and flatten it back out to 0. Now these are little things that creep up in you in cinema. I notice it all the time when I'm coaching people. You open their scene, there's weird things going on with nulls and the children that's in the nulls kind of possessing each other's rotational parameters, where you've rotated the children a little bit and then you've rotated the parent and then the rotations are overlapping. These kind of things I just like to sprinkle into my videos when I see them, because it's important to watch out for it and not ignore it, because little things like that can really cause hindrances in your scene. So if we come back to frame 0, and I'm going to put the spherical field kind of at the back and the bottom, right? And we can actually just, again, it's paying attention to the inner offset and how gradual that's going to be. So if I just pop it at the back here, and you can see there is this bit here where it's not quite catching. So we've done that, right? We've set up something like a growth solver. So if we turn back on the particles and we turn on the wind, and now in this wind in the fields tab, if I drag in the vertex map and I click this, you're going to see there's a couple of different modes here. Now these modes are going to affect how the wind gets triggered. The mode that it comes on by default, you can see now it gets triggered progressively. This is going to be the mode that we want, because what this does is after the vertex map turns yellow, the wind gets triggered on those particles perpetually. But if we do something like average, what that's going to do is kind of after they leave the area again, the wind comes off. So basically what's going to happen is the second it goes yellow, it triggers the wind. For that individual frame, or a couple of frames, it's going to tell the particles, this is your velocity, this is the direction to go, but then they're not going to get affected by the wind anymore. So you're going to get a bit more of a stagnant effect, where, yeah, they still move, they still go in directions, but they're not going to keep moving. So it's kind of important to know these different modes and what we're doing. We're going to use nearest. It does go a little bit slower because of it, but it's going to keep getting affected. So what we're going to do now, of course, is come to our turbulences, and we're also going to drop in the vertex map, just keep it on nearest, and do the same thing in all of them, re-enable them. And adding these extra modifiers is going to make the scene a little bit slower, but it's still going to run relatively quickly. And you can see now the particles drop as that vertex map grows across the object. So if I came back to the beginning, and I'm just going to keep turning off the turbulences just so the viewport goes a little bit quicker. And we did it from the top. Let's see what happens. Goes from the top. Now this is a way quicker workflow. Now that bit is creeping up. That's not very good. But you can see this is a way quicker workflow than animating a linear field, animating any kind of field, because I can just move this anywhere and it's going to grow around the object and cause them to fall off how I want them to fall off. But I am going to stay near the bottom corner here. I'm going to come back to the vertex map and try and tackle this little bit that's not turning yellow. I'm just going to increase the radius of the freeze. So it's going to grow up. Now let's try and get as close to 10 as we can. What happens if we put it down on 5? You can see that barely covers anything. 11 will do. That covers everything. It grows up. Now there's a lot you can do with these vertex maps. You could make the craziest growth solver you wanted to make by overlaying it with random fields and doing different things, and doing it maybe even on a little bit of a higher density object, because your vertex map quality comes from the amount of polygons. Now I'm keeping this tutorial quite simple and quite delicate, but if we wanted this vertex map to be sharper and have more detail, we would need more polygons. So you could do that on this main object, but that might have too many polygons. So you might want to do it kind of in the middle. It doesn't really matter where this what kind of object this vertex map is on, as long as it's in vicinity, and it's probably going to get a better result doing it on a version of the object you're emitting on. But you could go really crazy with this, and you could really, really do a crazy growth solver. But this is enough for what we want today. It's just this simple boom all the way up. So come back to the emitter, turn that on. I'm going to leave the turbulences off right now. and we have this cool effect. So I'm going to make a save. Now there's a couple more things we have to do before we can cache this and before we can do some renders with it. I want to transition the tutorial into a sort of final touches particle sim type stage, like I usually do. But there's something I want to mention. In my last tutorial, I was struggling with the fact that the particles were flickering. Now this turned out to be with using a kill modifier, and we're going to do the same today. But what can happen is in your render tag, where we'll be rendering the particles, if you have more than one object, and usually I would say set up your scale variation, which is very important to make a particle sim look good. Set up your scale variation in your render tag. But what happens when we use a kill modifier is when those particles die, it reassigns the different objects to different particles or points. Since particles are just points, select the particle group and select this. You can see I've got 500,000 points. And if we zoom in on these, the particles are just points. That's all they are. So what we're actually going to have to do is set up our scale variation inside the particle simulation. But what did I say? We had a kill modifier. And why is that important? Is because if all of these particles are dropping down, now if you've got them dropping on a floor, wherever you have them dropping on, this might not matter so much. But we can drastically speed up this simulation by, when the particles drop off the camera, having them, maybe we come out a little bit, and we come down a wee bit. By the time they drop off the camera, by the time they're down, we don't need these particles anymore. We don't need them to be alive. So if we go to simulate conditions and we grab a field condition, we put this in the particle group, and then we go to simulate modifiers, grab a kill, put this in the field condition, go to the field condition, add in a box field. And if you just turn up the inner offset, and we're going to make this bigger. Now, don't worry about it being a box field. They're not going to fall out the other side and come alive again. As soon as they enter this, they're going to die. So it doesn't really matter how thick it is. But if we put this here, I come back to the camera and I see, yep, that's fine. Maybe a little bit lower. I hit play. You're going to see now that the particles, as soon as they drop into that box, they're going to get killed. Now that's just massive scene optimization. It's going to save you a ton of time on your cache and just the way your scene kind of moves in general, because we're going to use a lot of particles here, a lot more than 500,000. So having them get killed off is quite important, because you can see now I'm all the way down at 100,000 already. So if we group this up and we call it kill modifier, and I'm actually going to decapitalize these because nothing else has caps. So, although the rock and the collide do, but nothing else in the particle group does. Right, so kill modifier. Now, like I said, this was causing issues where it was causing flickering, because when these particles would die, it would take a particle object out of this group, it would reassign it to one up here, and then they would flicker. So how do we set up scale variation inside the render? I'm going to turn off the wind for a second. I'm going to come back to my main camera. I'm going to turn off the box field in the viewport as well, and the spherical field. And I hit play here on frame 1. Actually, I won't go in the camera, but I'm going to come up close. And I'm just going to drop my particle count down to 50,000. What we're going to do to set up this scale variation, there's a couple ways. In the radius, we could set up variance, which is very, very simple, where we add a bit of variance, and now they're all at different scales. That's one way of doing it. But I don't really want to do it that way. I'm going to go to simulate conditions, and I'm going to add a condition. And then I'm going to drop this condition in here. And what we're going to do is change the property to radius. We're going to keep this on and we're going to change this to inside range. Now this is going to be our radius, max radius and lowest radius. So let's do 2.5 and let's do 0.5. So now if we go to simulate modifiers math, we put this math inside the condition. We change the target property to radius. We change the source to property. The operation you can keep on assign. You change this property to radius. Now we've got a multiplier, and this is going to multiply the radius, so we don't want any of that, but we can set a variance. So if we do a variance of 1, and you hit play, you're going to see a little bit of a nicer random scale variation throughout everything. So I lowered my particle count to show you that, but if I come back up to 500,000, this is quite important, is we want some slightly bigger ones, some not so bigger ones. If we call this particles main, And in this condition, I'm just going to bring this back to 2. Why have I done that? It's because I'm going to set up some even bigger particles. And the way I'm going to do that, I'm going to duplicate this emitter. I'm going to call this particles big. Now, we don't need many of these. Maybe only like 5,000. Because if I go to the properties and I set this to 2.5 and I set the color back to constant and I make it pink and we hit play now, you're going to see that we have these little pink ones in there, but they're maybe a bit too big, so let's do 2. And you can see they're also varying their scale, but their max scale is a little bit bigger. But now we've got some bigger particles in there too. What's left to do now before cache is raise the amount of particles we have in the scene, because right now we have, ignoring this 5,000, I mean, what's 5,000, right? Like, it's nothing. But we have 500,000 here. On my render, I used 4 million. So in the tutorial, I'm going to do 3 million. So I'm going to add 3, 0. And if we hit play, you can see they're going to take a little bit longer to spawn in, but we have that 3 million. Now looking at these are still a little bit big. So let's just do 1.5 here. Cool. So we've got these little pink ones everywhere, and we have 3 million particles on the object. So now if you turn on your wind, turn on your turbulences, hit save in case anything goes wrong, and we play through this, particles are going to drop. It's going to be very laggy now though. And that's pretty much it for the simulation. We've got them being killed off, so the simulation's actually going to get faster the more we get through the simulation. The only other thing I'm going to do, I'm going to decrease the friction a little bit, increase the bounciness, and I maybe would add a little bit of friction sometimes. But I'm not gonna. I think this is nice and simple, and this is all we really need. So what we can do now is cache this. So I'm going to set the cache to 210 frames, which is 7 seconds. And I'm just going to hit cache scene. There is one last thing that we need to do, which I almost forgot, which is setting their angular velocity. So I'm going to change this from velocity direction to random. And I'm just going to set this to 50. And on their actual velocity, I'm going to change that to random as well. So this is going to make them face random directions when they spawn in. And it's also going to make them turn in random directions. And of course, we want to do the same here in the particle big. So random, random. 50, very, very important for particle simulations to do this. Now I was going to say after that we would be ready to cache, but I did try a little bit of a cache and the particle objects were still, and the particles were still kind of moving into the object a little bit. And we need this collision to be absolutely perfect. So I'm going to come back to this radius in the collide. I'm going to set that to 0. And I'm just playing right now on, that is on 3 million. I'm going to turn this down to 300,000 just again to make it a little bit quicker so we can see everything, because we need this collision to be perfect. So you can see if I come in the middle of the rock, you can see they're kind of falling through it a little bit. So let's maybe make this rock a little bit smaller again, and let's see if they move through. So there's a little bit there of them moving through. Nearly all of them are moving through now. I'm going to turn off the scale variation just so we can see a little bit more accurately. And you can see that that scale variation was actually causing the sort of dodgy collisions. So how do we get around that? Well, the way that we get around that is in the math here. We can change the operation to add. Now, I don't actually know why that helps, but it does. And that was just something I noticed when I was doing tests. So that's going to make the simulation look a little bit better. Particle main, change it to 3 million. You just want to watch out for those collisions. Make sure that there's no particles slipping through, because it is going to be noticeable. Don't overlook it. Don't think that you're not going to be able to tell. Those things are important. So make sure that it collides properly. Okay, so 3 million particles. Let's hit cache on this and then finish off the render. Okay, cool. So once you've got your cache, let's just go 30 frames in, 30 frames. Now that cache, even on 3 million, took a little while for me. So super important to get those particles killed off. It's really going to save you a hell of a lot of time. Let's maybe not go so many frames in, but the render here is going to be quite simple. So we're going to get Octane going again. We're going to turn on our lights. Now that's why it was so important to set up the scene earlier on, because now we've got everything set up. Of course, we don't want to see this collide rock, so we turn this off. We turn on our main one. And then what I'm going to do, and this is where Octane gets a little bit weird when it comes to rendering Cinema 4D particles. I'm going to drop in this cube. I'm going to set it to 20 centimeters. I'm going to move it all the way away. And I'm going to bring this down into Geo. I'm going to drop a Octane object on the particle group, set a geometry, put the cube in there. And these particles are going to load in. So you can see now we've got all these particles covering the object. 20 was a little bit too big, so let's do 10. And for some reason that made them bigger. So let's do 5. That actually looks quite cool. There's something about that. Don't know what it is. 5. Okay, so maybe it's staying true to size this time. Octane object tags and particles can tend to make particles very, very big, which can be a little bit weird sometimes. Let's do 0.5, 0.5, 0.5. Now it doesn't really matter what scale you set here. If the particle radius is bigger, it's still going to increase the size of those. Now we don't want it this small. Now I think it's having a bit of trouble updating right now, so I think I've brought it way down and it's not been updating properly because I think I did need it around about 10. That's what I had it as in my other scene, or I think it was maybe 4 in my other scene. I think 4 or 5 in my other scene, if I remember correctly. Now let's just turn it off, turn it on. Octane can be a bit like that, is if you're putting in numbers, it's taking ages, you just kind of have to, rather than resetting the render, you just have to force an update out of it. So you have to change a couple of things and then get it to kind of resend everything to the render. And then once it updates, you'll be fine. Let's turn it off, turn it on. They're still way too big. Way, way too big. Let's do 2. God, who knew it would be such a stress just getting the size of the particles right? Because we just need it to be a little bit more aired out. That's all we need. Need it to be a little bit more aired out. Okay, now I came back a couple frames. We're on a radius of 2. Have a look at that. Looks super, super cool. You can see it kind of cracking up the object, but you can also see on this particle radius how accurate it is to the object and also the amount of particles. So what I'm going to do material-wise, I'm going to grab a universal material. I'm going to put this on the cube. I'm going to drag. I'm going to bring this over here. I'm going to crank up the roughness. We're going to grab an instance color. We're going to drop the particle group in there. And then we're going to grab a gradient. We're going to put this in the albedo. And we're going to use that noise. So all I did was I went for colors similar to the rock. So I went from kind of like a gray to like some kind of sandy colors, some a little bit more saturated, up to a white. And I did this to make the rock material, and you can see that brings it to life a hell of a lot more. So watch that saturation. I want them a little bit more gray. Something kind of like this. And you can see you get that nice kind of color filtration through it. Now there's something I've completely forgot to mention during the render, but it's also this density distribution. If you just trigger that to noise, it's kind of going to give it slightly different density. Now I'm not really going to go back and change it, but that also makes a huge difference to the render and how it looks. But the other thing we have to remember now is that these particles are colliding a little bit below the object that we're spawning on. So because we're cached and stuff, we can just begin to scale that object down a little bit now as well. Just a tiny, tiny little bit. And that's going to make the collisions appear a little bit more accurate, because we spawned and then scaled them down. So you can kind of get around all that by just having different spawn objects and all that sort of stuff, but you can see the object's not clipping through all those particles now, and we're getting a much more natural look at all the particles. We can maybe just scale it up a tad more, because the base new rock here was clipping through all of them. So this is a little bit of a different effect to what I was aiming to do with the whole idea. Because again, if I bring up these references, we've got this kind of swipe with the grass. I might do a version of that on the Patreon. And then we've kind of got these reveals. I'm going to put a project file like that up on the Patreon. I kind of just wanted something a little bit more directed and specific for the video. And because we set up the render beforehand, like this is really all like we have to do. We don't have to do much. And this is how I done it. The last thing I would do is add a little bit of motion blur. So what I love about this is you can see the cracking. And if you want to see how we would do an actual disintegration effect with this, then let me know, and I'll see what I can do. We're going to save a version of this, and let's come to like frame 30. So you can see now with this amount of particles, how good that looks. Again, that object's just sort of, it's just peeking through a little bit. So let's just bring it down a touch. Now ideally you get the collision working with both these objects the same size, but there's more than I could hope for in a little bit of recording. But look at that, that just looks insane. That looks awesome. So the last thing I would do to make this look awesome is I would come to motion blur, I'd pause the render, hit save, because Octane motion blur's like that. I would set this to 0.15, enable it, hit render again. Motion blur is what brings particle renders to life. So you get that motion blur on there. Let the render come back on, and you should have something that looks very, very nice. There you have it. Tons of motion blur. Particles ripping off this rock. So super interested to see how you guys use this effect. Like I said, first time people to hit that link in the description, Patreon for free for a month, 50% off. Otherwise, bunch of project files up there from tutorials recently. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Goodbye.